Good morning, good evening, good night, wherever and whenever you are. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is episode 22 of the Subversive Liberty Podcast. Well, what's up, everybody? Today we are, as you can tell by the title, we're going to be talking a little bit about tax reform. Not so much the nitty-gritty. This is going to be a quicker episode. I just wanted to give some thoughts about what tax reform should really look like. So let's get into it.
Not from school, and it keeps me from believing is that liberty dies, not among outcries, but thunderous applause. And every single day, I'm just trying to tell the world something. Will you listen? No matter what they say, time cannot move the other way.
Hello again, and welcome to the show. This is the Subversive Liberty Podcast, and I am your host, Brian Thornton. Don't forget to follow us on all forms of social media at subversiveliberty.org/subscribe, and you can find me by searching Brian Thornton Jr. in any search engine, but at Brian Thornton Jr., that's THORNTON. Once again, thank you to all the people who have been checking out the page. Actually, before we start talking about tax reform, I want to let you guys, especially the podcast listeners, know, if you haven't seen it already, on our Facebook page, on our Instagram, and on our Twitter, we have started a new segment at Subversive Liberty. We're calling them Subversive Minutes. I know it's very creative, but the point is to create a 60-second video that teaches. A 60-second video where we're trying basically to talk about a specific topic, idea, and just trying to narrow it down into 60 seconds so it's shareable, consumable, giving you guys something else to look at and to check out when you come to the page. So that's a new thing, and I believe if you check out at least the ones that Khalil's done, he has a form. So if you're at all interested in contributing to us and you have something that you think would be a great topic for a Subversive Minute, definitely let us know. You can write it up yourself, and then we'll take a look at it, and if it works, we'll definitely publish it. And of course, if you have something, I always ask if you guys have ideas, especially the people who listen. I would if you have something that you want us to cover in that kind of a format, definitely let us know. Let myself, Khalil, or if anybody who works at the project, or just post it on the page. So that's a really cool thing we've been doing. I've been enjoying it, and that's kind of gonna be what starts the conversation for this episode, because I put one out. It was called like tax reform, and then the reform was in quotes. Where I basically I tried to express some of the frustration of the way. I didn't get into it really in the video, but that's what the podcast is for. Basically my frustration, and because I don't think that this is really much of tax reform. It looks like there's a couple good things within the bill, and frankly, it's not really worth us taking a look at exactly what's in the bill yet, because it's still going to have to go through some kind of reconciliation or some kind of conference meeting where the two houses are going to come together, and everything is going to get switched around. There is an article that I'm going to share with you guys that I thought was really interesting that deals with one of the possible outcomes of the bill in the Senate. But let's start with the idea of tax reform, because of course it doesn't really matter if you're going to reform the tax code or not. You're going to call it tax reform, right? And certainly the media is reporting it as this, and this is exactly what the Republicans want it to be reported as, because they want to be seen as keeping their campaign promises, which of course we haven't really seen a lot of that actually coming to fruition in the Trump administration. Now, have we? Frankly, I think most of that's for better. Considering the massive expenditure that would go into building the wall and just the general ickiness of that entire situation. What was the other one? Healthcare. That's an unfortunate one, that there hasn't actually been any healthcare reform, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen. And frankly, I don't think that was an issue that President Trump ever really cared about, because he is on record multiple times of talking about how he thinks that that a universal system would work in some form or another. And then the third one, of course, is tax reform, the one that Republicans are always trying to push through. And unfortunately, for lack of an alternative, they are the only party of any significance in the United States that actually that at least purports to care about fixing taxes and cutting taxes for the individual. Which doesn't seem to be even happening in this one, because I think most of the analysis I've seen seems to say that the best thing would be the corporate income tax rate / which could hopefully lead to more growth. But one of the ways in which, and of course, whether these bills are going to run high deficits, it's going to add to the debt. And by doing that, you're not actually solving any of the problems. And so if you're somebody who thinks what I would consider to be rightly that we need to decrease the size of government and we need to cut the spending of the government, you should have, rather than even a tax bill, you should have a bill focused on spending, focused on cutting spending within the federal government, because one of the ways, because they can cut taxes as much as they want in these instances, because they'll just borrow the money or they'll just print it. And of course, that just continues the cycle, which again, if we're going back to the three issues that I think are the most important, it comes down to the wars, the debt, and our monetary policy. And anything in regards to and debt is just a tax on the future. That's the point of debt, right? Like when you take out a loan, the idea is you have a high time preference for that money at that moment. The other person has a low time preference, and so you agree to pay them back with interest over a certain period of time, so that you can use that money for something that's supposedly valuable and will pay off in the long run. Whether that be a house, whether that be a car, whether that be a college education for a lot of people. That's the basic idea of when you take debt, and it's something that will come due at a later time. And what keeps happening in Washington D.C. and really in all governments today, because they are driven by this. In some ways they're driven by our monetary policy, and they're also driven by economic ideas that state that spending is the most important thing, and that consumption drives demand, and that what's the basic Keynesian viewpoint, that when there is a slowdown in the economy, you need to have completely lost it. You need to have deficit spending, which means that the government needs to spend more than they actually take in. And of course, the GOP tax plan has massive deficits in it, as I understand it, as it exists currently, which is frankly surprising. Why that certain people like Rand Paul voted for it. I don't know if that's just a move for political capital, or if he actually thinks it's going to work out, or if it could be because of at least one of the provision that I am going to talk about that was in the Senate bill that I thought was rather interesting. I liken this in the Subversive Minute short, and you can I'll link to it on the show notes page for this episode. You can see it on our Facebook page. Again, definitely check those segments out. But I likened it, like, the best way I can describe it, I feel, is like it's a fresh coat of paint on a dilapidated barn, or a dilapidated house, if you like. The type of building doesn't really matter. The point being, you can put a fresh coat of paint on something and you can make it look nice, so to speak. But if the foundation is cracked, if the walls are caving in, if the inside is rotted, then that doesn't really do so much for the resale value or for the actual people living there, right? Because if you're going to put a fresh coat of paint on the outside, that's just for appearance's sake. And really, considering the fact that this bill doesn't seem to do anything to actually stop spending, I think they always say these things have to be revenue neutral. So the idea is they cut taxes in one place, but they increase it in another place. And that way they can say they're still going to bring in the same amount of revenue. Well, the problem is we're taking in too much revenue. And it's not revenue, by the way. It's money taken from people. The government doesn't earn this. This is not done on a voluntary basis. And maybe this should probably be another episode entirely, where maybe we can go over some basic libertarian ideas or liberalism understood properly, as I prefer to call it, about what taxation actually is and how it actually affects things. Long story short, it distorts the marketplace in a lot of ways. And now you can say that's good or bad. I would certainly argue that we need to simplify our taxes and lower them and decrease the size and scope of government and cut spending. And of course, there are people who disagree with me. And then even within people who would agree with me, there's many different solutions. Some people promote like a flat tax, a fair tax. I don't actually see, at least from my perspective, I don't actually see any one of them being better than the other. There's pros and cons to each individual tax plan. My hope would be that we can focus, again, bigger picture. We should be looking at how we're going to cut spending and where we can cut spending within the government. And there is plenty of redundancy in the government. If for no other reason, if for nothing else, doing something drastic, major, like ending the war on drugs would take billions of dollars, would free up billions of dollars, and could go back to the people and wouldn't have to be used towards anything else, and could just be spent better in the economy. And why is it spent better? Because private individuals spend their money better than the government spends their own. What's my evidence for this? Well, the fact that they're willing to leverage everything in the government because they're the lender of last resort. They're the ones who control the printing press. They're the ones who are going to be able to print the money, or just to raise a tax in the future in order to pay it off. It's not actually the institution of the government itself that pays anything. Of course, it is the people within the country. And if you think that our government has been spending the money wisely, the trillions and trillions of dollars, well, then maybe you should come on the show and tell me exactly what you think the government is spending money on that's good. And we might agree, and we might disagree. And we'll probably disagree on that matter. But what I certainly think most people can agree on is that the government is, I would hope they would think the government is bloated, especially the federal government, and that there's redundancies that can be taken care of and taken out. And all of this should, I guess, come with tax reform, but instead what always happens in Washington is we talk about tax reform, but we don't actually fix the institutions of Washington. Of course, whether they take in the money or not, if they decide the budget needs to be whatever number they decide, they're just going to authorize more debt. They're going to authorize budget deficits, and they're going to print, and then they're going to go to the Fed, and the Fed is going to print more money and put it into the economy in the form of, they're buying treasury yields and things like that. And so that money doesn't actually end up working its way into the larger population, and it helps out the people who are the most connected and who have access to those funds, namely like the banks. And these are ideas that are talked about in a lot of different talks and stuff that I've listened to, and it's of course covered within theory, but it really is remarkable to think that this kind of a conversation doesn't actually happen. If you're lucky, you might get, and I'm talking about it like the mainstream news, and certain, and I do feel okay in saying this because of course I know that if you consider yourself a progressive, well, then you don't necessarily think that the size of government should decrease. You think that essentially we should just be spending the money better, right? Because I think usually how it would go, let's say we did end the war on drugs, they would say that money should be put into a universal healthcare system. And of course the economics of that are completely wrong. And it's not that something like that couldn't work, because people will always find a way to make things work, especially when it comes to something as important as health. Again, as I've covered this in another episode, but what I really think is important there is the idea of that when you bureaucratize a system, when you centralize a system like that, you remove a lot of the means of innovation. You remove a lot of the ways of experimentation. And this also connects to the way that the regulatory environment is set up to favor employer-based insurance, and how that has distorted the marketplace. And that all traces back to a single government regulation. And this is, and these are kind of the points that you yell to the wind if you're somebody who favors free markets, because of course most people don't. Usually, what you'll get to is, that all may be right, but I just want people to have health care. Which of course assumes that people who favor a free market don't want people to have access to healthcare. It flies in the face of actual reason. You have to assume some very negative things about other people in order to think that they don't want that. And of course, the problem with political systems in general is that it actually incentivizes that behavior, right? It is better for a Democratic politician to say that their adversary doesn't want poor people to have health care, instead of recognizing the nuance of a position, because politics thrives in the lack of nuance. It thrives in dichotomy, which is, again, because of the way that incentive structures are set up. So I wanted to talk about this article that was written by Jeffrey Tucker over at FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, which if you don't follow that page, I would highly recommend it. They put out some really good content. I'm a fan of Jeffrey Tucker. I've been fortunate enough to meet him a couple times. He's a very nice guy, and I always like the way that he can kind of talk around issues and bring up interesting points. And so the headline of the piece is the Obamacare mandate is a tax, so the Senate bill is correct. So I've heard that Rand Paul was part of the reason why this was maybe put in there, in which case it would be evidence as to why he was willing to vote for it. But essentially what the Senate bill has is a repeal of the individual mandate. Now, if you recall, the individual mandate is pretty much the entire Affordable Care Act, really. Without the individual mandate, there really can be no exchanges, and what the individual mandate does is that it necessitates you buy health insurance, or you pay a fine. which goes up over time. And this was what was at the center of the what was it, the National Federation of Independent Business versus Sibelius, which was a huge 2012 Supreme Court decision where, of course, if you all remember, John Roberts was the swing vote. And basically what they argued was that this mandate was not forcing people to buy a product as it was a tax, which is to say that, that's how they were able to get it past the Supreme Court, which therefore makes it complete and fair game for a tax plan. And this is similar to a lot of the stuff that you'll see with President Trump rolling back different executive orders that the President Obama did. Well, this is in many ways, the problem with representative democracies and with republics, so to speak. And then more importantly, to the second point I made about President Trump just doing a lot of executive orders, the problem with centralizing so much power within the executive branch within the American system. Because it makes it that much easier for the next person to come in and roll it back. And so I was really thinking today, and really when I think about tax reform, it's, let's say best case scenario, somebody like Ron Paul was able to get us the best tax plan ever when he was serving in Congress, or Thomas Massey or someone today gets to pass something through. Unless there is a fundamental shift within the society, within the cultures of what we call the United States of America, towards favoring a lower tax, lower spending type of government, we are always one step away from another government coming in and increasing it. Which is, of course, this is a large part of a lot of libertarians' critiques of the state, and as certainly as it's developed, is that it seems that a state always tends to grow in its power, and it rarely, if ever, seems to shrink. Now, I'd like to think that it would be possible to shrink it voluntarily and peacefully, but of course, the few examples we have of a smaller state breaking off have all been violent, and of course, that was the story of the United States of America. So it's always ironic when you start to consider the fact of how large our government is, how much our government controls, how much our government taxes us, that we see how far away we've moved away from that original vision. And look, I think there's a good portion of the people today who think that the vision of the Constitution, the vision of what the United States was supposed to be about, and it's not like the founders agreed even amongst themselves, right? You immediately had the breaking off of political parties pretty soon after the Constitution was adopted. You saw people who were allies during the war become political adversaries, and in fact, kill each other, lose friendships, don't speak to each other, say really, really horrible things about the other person. And it is my contention that is just the nature of politics and what politics tends to bring to society. Which is why I think trying to move beyond politics is a good place to start. And that doesn't mean that politics gets to go away. It means that we start to realize of what its place is, and the types of things it should be involved in, the type of things it shouldn't be involved in. And one thing it should not be involved in is trying to tell people how to live their lives and how to spend their money. If we, and I don't see it likely of there being a 0% income tax at any point in time, that the government is not going to collect any taxation through forcible means, which is, of course, the only way. It's not voluntary, which is, again, part of the central tenets of libertarianism, and I understand that not everybody agrees with that. But my point is to say that I recognize that that's not going to happen, that the culture isn't, that our culture, our society, our nation, whatever term you want to use, is not at that point. And this is why I think it's really important to try and talk about things differently and try to approach things from a different standpoint. And the standpoint is this: we spend too much money. It is kind of as simple as that. There is not enough money in the United States right now to pay off the debt that the government has. And the only reason why the dollar is worth anything is because it's attached to the price of oil. And oil is something that's integral to the economy. If somebody else creates a currency that they start to trade oil in, which the Chinese have done, that could drastically affect the way that Americans live their lives. Because one of the reasons why we do so well not being on a gold standard, even with the amount of money that we spend, is that America has always been one of the more prosperous nations, and the most prosperous nation in the world, frankly. And for most of history, they were able to always pay the debts. And frankly, there might be the case that we're always going to pay the debts going forward in the future. And in a lot of ways, I think there's just there's a psychological hurdle that needs to be overcome, where people have to realize that these things are real and that they need to be addressed. But the problem is that politics is too short-sighted. Politics as an institution is more concerned with short-term thinking than long-term planning. And even the bureaucrats who think about long-term planning are always going to protect their work jobs. So let's say that the bureaucrat figures out that really they're redundant to the system. They're not going to put that in a report, because that would put them out of a job. That would mean they can't grow their department. That means they can't get a pay raise, right? So the long-term planners that are in the bureaucracy, that I would argue at least many progressives would think are doing the proper work of government, and that they in fact should be there, are not well, they're not really interested in the ideas that maybe somebody like myself would put forward, which again is really as simple of, let's cut spending, let's allow people to keep more of their money, from the richest to the poorest, because really it's so strange to me. It really and maybe it's not to anyone else. I don't know. But I do find this strange how much people obsess about the rich. I suppose this is something that is almost seems silly to even bring up, because it's such a given in our day that people are going to demonize the wealthy for having wealth. And of course, the rallying cry of every Democrat and socialist out there is to tax the 1% their fair share. Now, listen, of course, I don't agree. Nobody that I know that supports free markets agreed with the bailouts, which was, of course, the big progenitor for like the Occupy Wall Street movement. And nobody agrees with the government bailing out. Again, that's taken money that's then being given back to people who screwed up. No, those businesses should be allowed to fail. But the more you start looking into these things, the more you realize how interconnected they are, and how they all are basically, they're without, if one goes, the rest can go. And I think there's a lot of linchpins in this scenario that, if removed, will start to take away the veneer of the state. And in some ways, we're already Donald Trump is doing this frankly, it's weird to watch, because so many people just hate him, and so they're not actually looking at what's happening. But I actually didn't plan to talk about this originally, but I think I'm going to, I wanted to talk about, I've been kind of trying to figure out what to say and what to think about all these representatives leaving Congress. And, the first thing to say is that libertarians are on the side of consent. So in that any man or woman engages in inappropriate and unwanted physical sexual contact is reprehensible and does not line up with libertarian values, would break the non-aggression principle, because you're aggressing on another person's self-ownership, and those types of people should not be in positions of power. Now, here's the interesting thing. We really see this in full sway with the Roy Moore situation, because even more than President Trump, and I know people like to talk about that Access Hollywood video, but I'm not going to fall on my sword trying to break down that video and to talk about, and to maybe make mention of the fact that that's maybe just how some dude talks after he's talking about getting rejected by a woman. I don't think it's appropriate. It's not the way that I like to speak. It's not the way that I expect my friends to speak around me. It's not the type of language that I would pass on to anybody, any of my cousins or any future children I may have. But that doesn't. I don't know that in and of itself is the indictment that a lot of other people see it as. But that doesn't change the fact that politicians have been getting away with stuff like this, and lots of powerful men, you could say, have been getting away with, in a lot of different industries have gotten away with this throughout history, but especially the politicians. And what bothers me most of all is the fact that they've been using public funds to the taxpayer. So I say good riddance. I say good riddance to anybody who's accused of sexual assault on Capitol Hill. Let them go home. Let them figure out a better way to contribute to society than going to Congress. Because if you are going to do something like that, and you can't keep your hands to yourself, or you can't keep your mouth to yourself, and you just have to, you have to act inappropriately, well, then I'm not sure what you are doing, because you are handsomely compensated for that role, and you are you should be better than that. But of course, if anything, what I hope this shows is that politicians are not better than the average citizen. And in fact, they could be just as nasty, they could be just as dumb, they could be just as foolish as the next person down the road. And one of the reasons why, if you're wondering, people like that can get into those positions has a lot to do with the perverse incentive structures within the government. And the fact that, and I think the Roy Moore situation really exemplifies this, because man, what a weird guy, honestly. Like, if you look into his history, and I don't agree with his viewpoint of Christianity and how he thinks the law should be applied at all. I think it's really poor, frankly. And it's very strange to see the way people are gravitating around him. And let's say none of it's true. Do you really want to vote someone like that in? Even with the possibility, I don't know that I would, and I don't live in Alabama, and I wouldn't be voting Republican anyway. But I find it very interesting to see that, really, if you look at his support, I think what a lot of it would come down to is that they don't like the Democrat more than they like him. I would kind of have to hope that, although of course it could be the case that they just think that all these allegations are false. And one of the problems of this moment, is the fact that a lot of these allegations come from so long ago, and so it's very difficult it's very difficult to prove it other than just believing someone. And look, again, I don't like people who assault women. This is a very easy thing that should be taken for granted, but for some reason needs to be said. I think that when you look at all these guys going away, I think it's a good thing. It could be interesting because not all these people will be reelected, so there will be, I'd kind of prefer there just to be special elections, but of course, that's up to the individual states, because one thing that could happen very easily is that if, the governor appoints someone who's politically connected, well then, that person probably is going to win the reelection, because most people win reelection in Congress. But I think that could do a really big shakeup for the second half of the first term of Trump's presidency. I am certainly always happy to see, in general, I prefer to see seats changing in Congress as opposed to the same people staying there, because the longer that happens, the more often we're going to have a continuation of what we have currently. And that's not good. And that goes from the fact that these people think it's appropriate to spend taxpayer dollars on settlements for sexual harassment instead of, not doing it in the first place, or recusing themselves and stepping down from an office they are obviously not capable of holding. And I would argue that most people aren't either. And that's not to denigrate anybody. I think that there's too much power, especially within Washington, D.C. And I find it fascinating that for the types of ideologies that are obsessed with power dynamics, they seem to miss a pretty big one, namely the relationship between the state and the individual. And I could go on about that last one, but I think I'm going to save that for next week, because I'm still working on some stuff with that. But guys, thanks so much for listening to the show. Hopefully you guys liked this one. I'll have that article that I talked about a little bit on there. The basic point was that, remember, things can get overturned pretty quickly, and that's why it's, rather than political victories, we should be focused on as people like to say, changing hearts and minds, and focusing on talking to individuals and talking to people as individuals, and trying to think. Again, I'm trying to give a different viewpoint than what you're going to see in the mainstream, and more importantly, even in a lot of the alternative media sources that are decidedly left-wing or decidedly right-wing, or even decidedly libertarian, because I think I'd like to think I can go against my own side, so to speak, as well. And hopefully you guys have been enjoying the show. Hopefully you're sharing the show with a friend, and if you could, that would be awesome. Even if you grab their phone for them, search for Subversive Liberty in iTunes or in whatever podcatcher that they use, and have them sign up like that. Don't forget to check out the Facebook page, the Twitter page. Let us know what you think about the Subversive Minutes. Let us know what ideas you guys might have about like big news stories or big idea topics that we could try and put in some sort of 1-minute format. It's frankly kind of fun to try and figure out how to do that, because obviously I like doing the podcast thing, which lets me just kind of ramble for a long period of time. So I like focusing myself in that way. So guys, don't forget, if we fear what we do not understand, the answer must be to try to understand everything. So I hope you have a good morning, a good evening, and good night.
Not from school, and it keeps
from believing is that liberty dies not among outcries but thunderous applause.
I know nothing. Every single day I'm just trying to tell the world something. Will you listen? No matter what they say.